After a 2-hour plane ride, train strikes, one very expensive Uber, and a 2-hour ferry later, we finally arrived in Lenno in Lake Como, Italy, where we spent the next 5 nights. Lake Como is a beautiful part of the world, and it's full of the most delicious gluten-free foods. From gluten-free pizza, gelato, to some of the tastiest seafood, Lake Como provided us with some of the best gluten-free foods I've had on my travels to date. So much so, I was seriously considering moving there.
Can we move to Italy? Should we move to Italy? Baby, should we move to Italy?
Yes.
We're staying in Italy. We're Italian now.
Due to the train strikes, we arrived several hours later than expected, but the 2-hour slow ferry that took us from Como to Lenno was definitely worth it, as the views were breathtakingly beautiful. I had certainly built up an appetite by this point, so it's a good thing I came prepared. I had the Mediterranean rice salad, which is a homemade recipe that I recently posted to my channel. I'll link that in the description for you. Once we'd arrived in Lenno, we had a short but sweltering 20-minute hike to our accommodation. If you've seen any of my previous videos, you'll know how much I stress about booking self-catering accommodation. If you have celiac disease or food allergies, it's incredibly important, as you'll always have an option to cook home-cooked meals if you're struggling to find something to eat. This was probably the best Airbnb we've ever stayed in, due to how stunning and clean it was. The kitchen was fully kitted out with everything we needed. We had a full fridge freezer, a dining table and chairs, a microwave and a gas oven and hob. The host was so sweet and accommodating, they even left a tin of tomatoes and a box of pasta in case we needed to make a meal on arrival. Of course I couldn't have this, as it was regular pasta, but the thought was still there. But my absolute favourite part about this place was this. Later that evening, we went to Ristorante Giglio for dinner. Not only was the food fantastic, but the waiter was extremely friendly and helpful with gluten-free options. He told me which of the dishes were safest for me and free from cross-contamination, and he even brought me some gluten-free bread to enjoy with my meal. I had the risotto, which was made with cuttlefish ink, sweet pepper cream, and a wasabi ice cream. I'm so glad I went for this dish because it was absolutely incredible. And speaking of incredible, this was the view from the restaurant. Day 2 in Lake Como began with a trip to the local supermarket. We went to Dino Market, which was a short walk from our accommodation. There wasn't a dedicated gluten-free section, but we just had to rummage through everything to try and find what we were looking for. But in amongst all the chaos, we did manage to find some gluten-free bread and gluten-free pasta. The store had most things you'd need, including a large fruit and veg section, a deli counter, some dairy products, and they just had a bit of everything really. We took a little stroll around Lenno after breakfast while we waited for our ferry to Menaggio. I would highly recommend the ferries in Lake Como. They were super reliable, and although they may take slightly longer to get places than in a car, the views are totally worth it. I'll also link the ferry company in the description too. We saw online that you could walk all the way from Menaggio to Lenno, so that's what we were planning to do that day. But before we left this town, we came across a restaurant called Dal Tato serving gluten-free pizzas. We were told by the staff that all of the pizzas share the same oven, but they do cover the gluten-free pizzas so that there's no cross-contamination with the regular ones. All of the pizzas on their menu could be made gluten-free as well. I had the tomato, mozzarella and parma ham pizza, and I was really surprised to see that my gluten-free pizza didn't look that different from my partner's regular one. It was better than any gluten-free pizza I've had in the UK or on my travels so far. I highly recommend the pizzas at Tato, and the views from the restaurant were stunning. We set off on our walk back to Lenno, but around 10 minutes in we came across a dead end with no walkway, and as beautiful as that 10 minutes was, I was not willing to risk my life for a walk. So we turned back to Menaggio and got gelato instead. This place not only had a large selection of gluten-free gelato to choose from, but they were very careful with cross-contamination, as each tray of ice cream had its own dedicated scoop, and they even had gluten-free cones. I had the mango gelato, which was lovely and refreshing in the heat. This was definitely much better than a 2-hour walk back to Lenno. On day 3, we took a ferry to Varenna. I think of all the places we visited, Varenna was my favourite. It didn't feel as crowded as Bellano and Menaggio, and I personally thought that the scenery in Varenna was prettier too. Our first stop on arrival was to another gelato place, and it was the same concept as last time, individual scoops for each flavour of gelato and a gluten-free cone. This time I had the passion fruit gelato, which was my favourite. There was no indoor seating here, so we sat on some cushions on the steps outside looking out at the beautiful view. For lunch we went to Molo, and for a restaurant in such a busy touristy area, this place was incredibly beautiful. Again, the waitress was very confident about the gluten-free options and cross-contamination. There were a couple of things I was unsure of, so they double-checked everything for me for reassurance. They had a large menu and served a bit of everything, but I had the grilled cheese with a tahini slaw and a side salad, which was filled with chickpeas, mozzarella and sun-dried tomatoes. I shredded the chicken into the salad and added some olive oil and balsamic vinegar. I was also over the moon that I could have a dessert other than gelato for a change. Not that I was complaining about having too much gelato, of course, but I had a panna cotta with Sicilian pistachio sauce and it was amazing. The food and service here was fantastic. So I definitely recommend Molo if you're in Varenna. Just before we left to go back to Lenno, we came across another supermarket just a 3-minute walk from the ferry port. It's a very small store selling organic items such as fruit, fresh food and some essential toiletries, but they did have a dedicated gluten-free section there. So if you're in Varenna and looking to stock up on some gluten-free bits, this is the place to come. When we arrived back in Lenno, we went to Restaurant Lago for dinner and had a couple of small plates to share between the two of us. We had the shrimp tartare and the fish of the day, which was a sea bream. The sea bream came with a side of vegetables and they also gave me some gluten-free bread as well. This was the night I discovered I'm not really a fan of shrimp tartare. There was nothing wrong with it just wasn't for me. They also had a large selection of local wines to choose from as well. We spent day 4 of our Lake Como trip visiting Bellano and Menaggio. We visited the waterfalls in Bellano, which were absolutely stunning. We wished we could have stayed here a lot longer than we did, but because of the crowds and the narrow walkways, we didn't have much of a chance to stop and we had to keep moving. So although it was beautiful, it only took us around 20 minutes to do the whole thing. But if you're in the area, I highly recommend doing this. We had a little bit of a wait until our next ferry to Menaggio, so we stopped at a place called Che Pasta. As we saw on their notice board, they had gluten-free pizza. The gluten-free pizzas are made and cooked separate from the regular ones, and all of their pizzas could be made gluten-free. I decided to keep things simple this day and went for tomato, garlic and herb for my toppings. And what can I say? There is nothing better than Italian gluten-free pizza. But no day would be complete without some gelato, of course, so we went to Gelato Matto. Gelato Matto had the best selection of gelato flavours out of all the other places we went to, and the process is exactly the same as before, separate scoops for each flavour and a gluten-free cone. This time I had a raspberry crumble gelato, and yes, it was gluten-free and it did taste as good as it looks. We took a ferry to Menaggio but didn't eat there because the pizza and gelato were so filling, but by the time we'd arrived back in Lenno, we had built up an appetite, so we ordered some takeaway from Bistro Il Golfo. But I definitely would not recommend eating here, as unfortunately I did get gluten on our last day in Lake Como, and this was the restaurant responsible for that incident. Day 5 was sadly our last day in Lake Como. It started off really well. We rented a boat and explored the lake on our own for a few hours. I will link the boat company that we went with in the description because they were worth every penny. Renting our own boat was the highlight of our trip, as we had freedom to explore pretty much the entire lake and we had the best time doing it. Once we returned the boat, we decided to get some lunch. So we went back to the restaurant we ordered takeout from the night before, Bistro Il Golfo. And that's the moment our holiday took a horrible turn. I was told that the risotto and couscous were 2 of their gluten-free options. The staff seemed very knowledgeable about cross-contamination and they seemed very confident about their gluten-free options. However, I did question the couscous with several members of staff. They reassured me that it was 100% safe and it was definitely gluten-free. Unfortunately, I had been misinformed and completely misjudged that situation and had a severe reaction about an hour later in my accommodation. Our original plan was to revisit Restaurant Giglio that night, but instead I spent most of my last night in Lake Como on the bathroom floor and in excruciating pain. As much as it disappointed me at the time to end our holiday this way, we did have a fantastic time up to that point, and I ate some of the best gluten-free foods that I've had on my travels so far. Lake Como is a special place and we can't wait to revisit again sometime soon.